Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are taking a highly structured, totally uncompromising journey through one of existentialism's most profound and honestly most challenging texts, Albert Camus' mid-century philosophical essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. If you have ever looked around at the world and wondered, what the point of it all actually is, you are absolutely in the right place. I am thrilled to guide you through this, because we're going to take some incredibly heavy concepts and break them down into clear, manageable takeaways. All right, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for today. We're going to hit 5 main stops. First, the ultimate question, then encounters with the absurd, defining the absurd, 3 responses, and finally, the choice to live. Let's get right into it. Okay, starting off with section 1, the ultimate question. We are definitely not starting with polite, traditional questions about happiness or the good life. Camus kicks things off with a massive pattern interrupt. He says, there is only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Wow, right? By just bypassing all those endless abstract debates, he forces us to ask literally the most high-stakes question possible. If we actually look at the universe and figure out that it is entirely meaningless, does that logically mean we should just end it all? So that's the absolute crux of the issue here. We have to address this deeply logical question head-on. If we strip away all our comfortable little illusions, our daily habits, our societal norms, and we just face the raw, silent universe, do we check out early? Does acknowledging that it's all meaningless demand that we just quit? Well, to even answer that, we first have to understand how we actually experience this feeling of meaninglessness in everyday life. Which brings us to section 2, encounters with the absurd. You see, before the absurd is some grand, highbrow philosophical concept, it's just a feeling. We really need to investigate how this abstract problem creeps into our totally mundane, everyday routines. Camus points out something so relatable. We live like 90% of our lives on pure autopilot. It's just the habit of living. You wake up, the alarm goes off, you shower, go to class, go to work. You just make the gestures that existence commands. But then, one day, the veil lifts. The big why suddenly pops up out of nowhere, and Camus says it begins in a weariness that's tinged with amazement. You're just yanked right out of your routine, and boom, that is exactly where the feeling of absurdity strikes. And this feeling, it doesn't usually happen when you're deep in meditation or anything. It happens in these weird, sudden flashes. It's like suddenly realizing you're 30 years old, and it hits you that you belong to time. You're just sliding down this irreversible continuum toward the end. Or maybe it's just looking at a totally normal physical object, like a stone or your phone, and suddenly perceiving just how brutally dense and strange it is. It completely loses its familiar purpose. It's also like watching a person talking behind a glass window, seeing their mechanical pantomime, lips moving, no sound coming out, and realizing how deeply silly human gestures can actually be. And finally, of course, it's the cruel mathematical certainty of death. Just looking at an inert body and realizing that literally no amount of pretty speeches changes the elementary reality of it. So what's actually happening in these jarring little moments? It's a profound sense of alienation. Camus describes it beautifully, actually. He calls it the divorce between a person and their life. In a universe that's suddenly stripped of all its familiar illusions and comforting lights, man just feels like an alien. He is a stranger, totally exiled in his own setting, completely deprived of the memory of a lost home or even the hope of a promised land. Moving right along to section 3, defining the absurd. All right, now that we've really felt the problem and we recognize how it sneaks up on us at a random street corner or when we're just exhausted, let's pull it all together. Let's clearly define what this concept actually is from a philosophical standpoint. To really understand the absurd, you have to constantly weigh 2 opposing forces against each other. On one side, you have us, the human mind. We possess this wild, desperate longing for clarity, for unity, for things to just make sense, right? We want a purpose. But on the exact opposite side is the world. The universe is dense, it's ultimately completely irrational, and honestly, it is totally silent to our demands for meaning. It simply doesn't care. Notice how Camus frames this almost like a mathematical equation. The universe, all by itself, isn't actually absurd. It's just irrational. And a human being by themselves isn't absurd either. The absurd actually requires both human consciousness and the silent universe colliding. It's the exact confrontation, the rupture, that total mismatch between our wild longing for clarity and the completely silent, indifferent universe. That friction right there, that is the absurd. Okay, let's check out section 4, 3 responses to absurdity. So, if that is the inescapable, literal reality of our existence, what on earth do we do about it? Throughout history, the greatest thinkers have noticed this profound divorce, and they've basically tried to solve it in 3 main ways. First up, you have the rationalists. They believe the world ultimately makes sense through reason or science. They just kind of push the absurd away and pretend it's not there. No leap needed. Then you have the existentialists, thinkers like Kierkegaard. They boldly recognize that the world is absurd, for sure. But then they lose their nerve. They make what Camus calls a leap. They jump to a conclusion that just isn't supported by the evidence. They'll say, well, the world has no meaning, therefore God must be the meaning, or they leap to some other kind of transcendence. And finally, we have Camus himself. He acts as our totally uncompromising detective here. He completely rejects both the rationalist pretense that the world makes perfect sense and the existentialist cop-out leap of faith. His choice? He refuses the leap entirely and chooses to stay with the absurd. But listen, before we can just fully adopt Camus' solution, we really have to look in the mirror and recognize how heavily we rely on cheating. We use all these false hopes to keep us going. A lot of times, we say no to suicide, not because we've actually solved the philosophical problem, but just out of pure instinct. The body simply shrinks from annihilation. Like Camus says, we get into the habit of living long before we acquire the habit of thinking. Or we trick ourselves with hope. We hope for a transcendent afterlife that we have to deserve. Or maybe we give our absolute undying devotion to some all-consuming political doctrine, like radical transhumanism or extreme political ideologies. We basically smuggle in meaning from the outside just to make the pain of the absurd go away. Which leads us to our final stop, section 5, the choice to live. This brings us to Camus' authentic, real verdict on how to handle an irrational universe, assuming we refuse to rely on false hopes or philosophical leaps. He writes, "For a man who does not cheat, what he believes to be true must determine his action." I love that. Camus demanding strict logical consistency from us here. If we've looked at the evidence and found that the universe is genuinely absurd, we can't just suddenly invent a comforting fairy tale at the last second. No way. If we acknowledge the absurd, we have to bravely follow through on that truth. We literally must act in accordance with it. So the solution is definitely not suicide. For Camus, suicide is just another way of running away, another way of escaping the confrontation. The actual solution is to choose to live without appeal. What does that mean? It means living face to face with the absurd, without appealing to a higher power, or future utopia, or some comforting little illusion. By keeping the absurd alive through your own conscious awareness, you maintain your revolt against the silence of the universe. You maintain your absolute freedom to act right now, in the present moment. And you live with a fierce, burning passion for the sheer experience of life itself, completely unclouded by false hopes. And that leaves us here, with the myth itself. You know, in Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll this massive boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll endlessly back down. It is literally the ultimate picture of useless, absurd labor. But Camus drops a bombshell. He says Sisyphus is actually the ultimate absurd hero. Why? Because he is fully conscious of his condition. He harbors absolutely zero false hopes that the boulder's going to magically stay at the top. Yet he pushes it anyway with pure defiance. So as you reflect on your own daily routines, your habits, your work, your own personal boulders, you really have to ask yourself, are you living with false hopes? Or are you living an uncompromising, awake life? Are you ready to imagine Sisyphus happy?